so one of the interesting problems that can come up is in computing education is setting up local machines. So there's lots of advantage to offline environments, but it can be a barrier to entry. And so the Python Anywhere online service can help avoid those problems. And I'm happy to introduce Brad Nielsen from Marist College Ashgrove as he covers how he's used Python Anywhere and the Flask web framework with his senior IPT students.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Brad. I'm from Marist College. I've been working there for 2 years now, teaching IPT. So I'm fairly new to the school and also new to teaching IPT. Before that, I'd had an education background in primary school, and then I'd gone and done 5 years of IT work with an IT degree. And then I decided I really missed education and wanted to get back into it. When I came to Marist College, there was actually no programming being taught because the regular IPT teacher had retired, and they'd convinced a business teacher to teach IPT while they could actually find a person to actually teach the curriculum. So I was very fortunate to get a job at Marist College, but it was also a really difficult task because I had to pretty much revamp the whole curriculum. And I'm happy to say that I'm starting to feel on top of things now. I've got Scratch being taught with Year 7s. I've got Year 9s doing a bit of robotics and Lego Mindstorms, and also learning how to create a website just using HTML and CSS. My Year 10s, I've got starting to learn Python. And I've chosen to get them using Codecademy to learn Python. We're a bring your own device school, so issues of, personally I'm not a Mac person, so it's actually very difficult for me to assist my students if they're using a Mac. And I've just found it easier to get into teaching programming rather than having to worry about configuration and settings. So I was on the lookout for a programming language that was easy enough to teach my kids, that there was a lot of online resources for, and if possible, something they could actually program online. Which drew me to Python. I think the other thing about Python is, like Peter touched on, it lacks that complexity of some of the other languages. You don't have to worry about curly braces and semicolons. It's neat and it's organised. And yeah, I found really great online resources. So I've got my Year 10s using Codecademy, and they're using Python 2.7 on Codecademy. I like the idea of students not being constantly hampered by what I'm teaching in class. So if they're using an online forum or exercises for their programming, then I don't have to keep pulling them back all the time. And while I do a lot of direct teaching, a lot of times I'm actually letting the kids go through the courses. They've got to produce a programming journal, and then I'm often that sage on the side where I'm assisting them with their programming. For myself, I consider myself a good programmer, but I'm not versed in all programming. I'd say my Python knowledge is about 80% now, and that's just been from using that experience of using it with my students. It was more difficult in the senior, Year 11, Year 12. I knew I wanted to get them into programming, but for those students, they had a very poor programming background because they hadn't done any programming prior to Year 11, Year 12. I found, particularly with my Year 12s last year, it was incredibly difficult, and they had, I didn't want to alter their work program too much, but they had web development as part of their work program, and so I tried to teach them a bit of PHP, and PHP is one of my least favourite languages. I find it very, very difficult to learn. But I like the idea that it combined their knowledge of programming with their database knowledge, which is something they also learnt in Year 11. So I like the idea of their major project being a culmination of their knowledge in programming and databasing. So I was on the lookout for a good Python-based web programming language. And I was also looking for something that could be set up easily, because I know last year I'd set up a PHP web server, and my students could only actually ever program when they were in the classroom. My school would refuse to allow me to to make the PHP web server public. So my students couldn't really program from home. And that was a real nuisance. So I had to look for a way of getting a web server that my students could program on. And I also wanted to keep going on with that Python. I wanted to keep building upon the Python that I had been teaching my junior kids. So I wanted to get that development process. I didn't want to be teaching them a whole new programming language when it gets to year 12. So with a bit of discussion, I've got a lot of friends who work in IT, Nick included. I heard about a Python web server called Django. And I then decided last holidays that I'd try to learn Django. And after about 3 days, I finally developed something using Django. And while you get that feeling of euphoria or that moment that you finally got something working, I also had this feeling of dread, because if it took me 3 days to learn Django, I knew that there was no way I could teach my students Django. Now that might be different for other people, but for myself, I just thought it was too far. It was too abstract. I found Django a very abstract type of web framework. It wasn't easy for me to program in. It was difficult for me to see what was going on, and I thought it was just too abstract for my students. So I also came across this website, and I was just having it up before. This is by far the best website I've found in terms of teaching students Python at a higher level. So, for example, people were talking about Pygame before. There's actually a whole lot of exercises here on this website that go through using Pygame 3 to actually develop a computer game. And I did that with my Year 11s this year, and it was a great success. The other thing is on web development, it talks about going through Flask and Django. So there's exercises there for students to do little things and then incrementally work up to something more detailed. And using those tutorials, I could then create an assessment where they had to use the knowledge they'd learnt and skills they'd learnt in those tutorials to develop something creative that was their own. So I fully recommend this website. And also, just to include, there's actually a whole lot of video tutorials that this particular developer has done where he actually talks through what he's doing. I found the tutorials slightly long, the video tutorials, but I also recommend them to my students. If they were having trouble, maybe they should sit through the video tutorial and just listen to this guy. All right, okay, so what are the benefits of Flask? I found Flask made it really easy to understand how a website, which is held online, can be interacted with. So in terms of server requests, where you actually hit a URL, it was very easy for the students to understand where they were going and what they were doing. And also in regards to sending or receiving form data. So every website has, if you create a text field or a text area, you're creating some form data. And I found Flask was a very simple way of actually receiving and handling that form data. Flask also made it really easy to render dynamic content. So if you have a website and it's being held on a server, when you hit that server can then put data back into that website, that web page, very simply. I found it very easy to place variables inside a web page, and I thought it had a reasonably low learning curve for my students. I thought it was quite simple, and it actually does that using another Python framework called Ginger, which is actually, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Ginger. It's actually a template library where you can actually create a web page that then inherits the HTML from another web page. So it's actually very easy for students to make a full-blown website without having to worry too much about their HTML. and also being able to revamp their website without having to worry too much about CSS. Flask was also, it made it very easy to interact with an SQLite database. There are other ways of interacting with other databases like MySQL or PostgreSQL, but I found SQLite is, well, it's pretty much embedded in the Python language. It's very simple to create yourself a database, and it was very easy to get that data from the database and then put it into a web page. And then finally, Flask had very simple session handling. So rather than having to worry about cookies and how I wrote cookies to pages and stuff, it was actually really, it had a really easy mechanism for saving data about a user. Okay, so this is by no means all my code or anything. I just thought I'd just show you how simple it was. And again, I've spent a few hours learning this, so it might not make sense to you straight away. But what I'm trying to pass to you is that it isn't too difficult for students to understand. In terms of Flask, there's one web file which actually handles all the server requests. And so what happens is that the actual page, which is a Python file, has directives where if a student goes to, or anyone goes to the URL with, say, /home, it goes to that part of the Python code and then runs the code directly below it. So you would actually have this block of code for your various pages in your website. And it handles all those pages, and it actually chooses what HTML to render. At the very simplest, what I could do is actually just have below here, and I could just go return HTML, and whatever I actually type in will actually appear as a web page at that URL. So it's actually a really easy way for students to understand how the server is actually dynamically creating the HTML that they're looking at. There's two main commands in Flask, and that's either redirect or render template. Render template basically says go to this HTML page and then show that to the user. Render template is show that HTML page to the user. Redirect is go to another directive and now run that code. So if they haven't actually logged in, all I'm doing is I'm going to redirect them to the login page. And that's how easy it is. Now, it might seem difficult at the moment, but Python Anywhere combined with this makes it really, really easy. All right. Form data and session handling. With your actual session, like writing cookies and stuff, that's as easy as creating a dictionary, putting in a value, and giving it a variable. As soon as you say session, and then you can create your own key, and you say equals something, that will actually automatically write something to the cookie in the user's page. So rather than having to worry about complex JavaScripts, I'm just doing that with Python. In terms of receiving data, again, you just need to follow this kind of syntax. You define the method, and then it's as easy as saying the variable is equal to request.form username. So if there was a text field called username on that HTML page and they've entered something into that field, then in terms of actually responding to that request, I can get the data. So I can get that data and then save it to a database. Or I can get that data and then check it with data that's already inside the database. One thing I didn't cover is how easy it is to pass variables into a page. So you can see here I've got return render template hello. So it's going to look for the hello page. And then I've created something called error is equal to error. That error is just the value of none at the moment. And if I pass that, that's the name of the variable that will be received into the page. So the page will actually can basically output the error, or it could, even if I just wanted to type in, I could type in error is equal to no error as a string, or I could pass it as a list. In fact, it'll take any data type. I can pass that into the page, and the page will be able to receive it. Render template, this is just an example. In terms of asking the server to do something, you just have to use this curly brace and a percentage symbol. This here says extend layout.html. Now, I gave all my students in year 12 a layout page, and then I asked them to then extend those pages. So it actually takes all the HTML that was in layout, shows that to the screen, and then there's certain areas inside layout that are defined as content, and all that happens is when it hits this page, it's going to put in all that HTML there will actually go inside my layout page. So the students aren't being bogged down by having to do massive HTML editing. And I actually made that even easier for them later on too. You'll notice that where it's got double curly brace error, that's where you actually call in a variable. So the variable is actually going into the page. And I could pass any variable from my server into that page. So that's what makes it so easy. The SQLite database connection was quite easy to set up. I'm not probably going to go into that too much today because it is a different topic area, although I would say there's SQLite tutorials on that web page that we looked at. So there's actually, if you go along, you'll find SQLite tutorials. I just found it really easy because in 3 lines of code, I could actually go to the SQLite database, call out an SQL query, which is different from Django. Django doesn't let you do SQL queries. You're actually having to go through an interface layer. This one actually lets you go through an SQL query, draw out the data you want, and then I can print that to the screen. So it's as simple as saying open connection, run this SQL query, get the data, close the connection, and then I use that data and I pump it back into my web page. Yeah, I also mucked around with MySQL a bit because in IT and in other occupations I've used MySQL, so it's something that I really like. But I actually found it quite difficult to use Flask with MySQL. That might change later on, but I found that you had to actually install kind of like an interfacing library just to run MySQL commands. Whereas SQLite, it's actually built into the language, so it was actually really easy to use an SQLite database. So using Flask was really easy. Finding the environment that students can easily develop on outside of school was hard. And I'm not quite sure how I stumbled upon it because you come to these, when you come to these conferences, you learn new things all the time. And when you're Googling the internet, there's so much out there. It's really difficult to know which way to go. Anyway, I know when I was mucking around with using Django or Flask with Visual Studio, it was letting me try to publish to Windows Azure. And I didn't really know much about Windows Azure. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Am I saying that right? Windows Azure? I'm not even sure I'm saying it right. But I then had a look and researched it. I Googled it up, found out what it was, and I found out you can actually, on Windows Azure, you can actually create a development environment, a server environment of Flask or Django. However, there was a subscription to it, and I wasn't willing to pay the subscription, so I decided I'd keep looking. Anyway, hence I found Python Anywhere, and the people at Python Anywhere were amazing. They basically set up the profiles of all my students. Python Anywhere is a cloud service, but it allows you to create a server environment. So you can run your own server. And you could actually develop your code online, and you can actually then see the errors from your code, which was perfect, because that way I didn't have to worry about the development environments of my students. I could get my students to develop their code and they're only using that one Python file for their Python code, and then I could find the errors. And what even made it, I'll show you in a second, but what even made it better was the fact that Python Anywhere, their developers, allowed me to be able to go into my students' code and have a look. I could see what it was going to look like, I could actually have a look at their errors, and I could actually have a look at their code, which is perfect for a teacher. So, I'll talk about Bootstrap and lay it out later on. It's not essential. So this is an example of Python Anywhere, and that's not the front page, but once you've actually created an account, which is free, you're then able to create a web application. Now, in a free account, you can only create one web application. So I won't be able to probably say I can't do it. There you go. Saying I have to upgrade. But once you click add a new web application, you can actually then choose either Flask or Django. And once you've set that up, you are given a URL. So this is my URL here. And again, students can see a live website rather than having to worry about developing locally where they can't share their work. This is actually a live website. So by clicking that, I can see the live website. You'll also find you have log files. So the access log will show you which IP addresses have actually tried to access your website. The error log will actually show you any Python errors that occur. And then I'm not sure about the server log. I'm not a network administrator, I'm afraid. And then if you wanted to, you could even password protect it so other people can't access. Then you've got files. The files are installed by default, which has again made it easy. I didn't have to worry about students creating files. They can create files later on as they extend their templates, but the files are created by default. And primarily what they're doing is they're going to my site, and they've got this Flask_app file. And that's like I was showing you before. So you've got these, sorry, I've created other functions here. You've got these directives, and every time someone tries to go to your website, just using these links perhaps, it'll actually just run that directive. So it goes to that directive and runs the code directly below it. I tried to go into admin, it's saying, no, redirects me back to login page. Here you can see an example of me using SQLite. I connect it to a database, I execute a command, and then I fetch all the records. And then I can pump those records back into a page. You can also put more than one variable into a page. And see here, I've put in a variable called active users. I've put in a variable called error. I've put in a variable called game. So I'm able to pass those variables to the page, and the page can then deal with them. All right, mine's a lot more complex than what my students did. And I also mucked around with hashing too. I found that you can actually hash your passwords using this library. It's something that I'm trying to get it so that it makes it a bit easier when it comes to year 12. So I'm thinking the last term of year 11, I'm going to be looking at encryption and database security. So I'm actually thinking even now that I might get my students to do a really simple exercise, maybe one page on Flask, and just get them to make sure they've encrypted their password. In terms of teaching with a class, I had to give them some code because they were going to struggle if I didn't. Certainly some example code. So what I did was for every student, I gave them my login script. And then I told them that as a minimum requirement for their projects, they had to actually develop a registration page with a registration script that could then save to the database. And I also told them they had to have an admin page where only the admin could go in and actually see which users were actually in their database. So that was the minimum requirement, and then from there I said, now you go forth and you make something creative and something that's going to amaze me. Just to show you mine, okay, so this is just my basic thing. I haven't fully developed the game lobby. I was trying to show them they could make a multiplayer game if they wanted to, which I did. So I've created my own little noughts and crosses game. And then you've got a register page. So that's mine, but mine's more advanced than theirs. I was a bit disappointed. Some of my students I would have liked to have seen like a multiplayer game, but it didn't happen for whatever reason. Most of them stuck to making a discussion forum. Others had like a product information place. So I'll just show you theirs. Just if you, like I said, you can go across here. All I did was, like, once I registered, I said to PyCon Anywhere, hey, I'm a teacher. And they said, oh, well, what's the list of your students? I gave them the list of my students, and they made it then. They set up all the students' accounts just using their email address. So my students, when they were developing this, they just had to go to their email address. And I think they were given a common password. But they all got emails basically saying the details. But you can see here, all my students are there. I can actually switch into their code, which I was just really, really impressed with. So one of my students, must have been sick of referencing because he decided to make his own APA referencing database. So this is his website. And you can see as soon as you log in, you get to see the list of the references that you came up with, that you saved in the database. You go to generator, add a reference. And if you were administrator, I actually made it, initially I gave all my students, just to show you, when you actually set up a SQLite database, all that happens is you drop in a file, SQLite, and I gave them all a test file, and in that test file, along with my login page, I gave them like just a simple users database that they had to then change, and I made myself I just had an admin. Most of my students ended up then changing admin, which I didn't actually want them to do because I wanted to be able to quickly go through and actually check their websites out from an administrator's view. Now, this is probably the only annoying thing, and maybe they'll change this one day, but with an SQLite database, I can't view this online. So to actually view the database, I actually have to download the database to my computer. And I also found a couple of really easy GUI tools that will actually allow you to edit an SQLite database. So one is SQL Expert Personal. Again, I was looking for free. And another one was SQLite Developer. Both were free softwares. And I actually got the IT guys to install this on our computers. So this is an example of my database. I gave them this test user database, and then they could create other tables. So they had to create a table for their forum and that kind of stuff. But it was actually pretty easy using this tool to actually make yourself new. So you could actually go into design and add new fields and that kind of stuff. Very similar to MySQL. How much time have I got, Nick? About a minute. All right. Just quickly, I wanted my students not to be doing... I thought you were going to give me a 5-minute warning. Or is that a 1 minute to the 5-minute warning?
I gave you the 5-minute warning.
Oh, I missed it. Right, so just quickly, so that my students didn't have to worry about CSS or HTML, I also found, I got them using Bootstrap. So Bootstrap's just like a CSS framework. And you can actually, there's a couple of really good editors online. So I've actually got this one. You can actually just drag and drop your components. And this one, you can actually just, online, you can actually adjust the colors and the look, or even download a theme. And all you have to do is, in terms of Bootstrap, I'll just show you my layout template. So this is my layout code. In terms of Bootstrap, all I had to do was link in those 2 lines of code. And once I did that, the students could actually just